I'm honestly thankful that survival horror genre developed the way it did. Unlike Souls-like, which was basically the brainchild of one studio for half a decade before anyone else took a stab at it, survival horror games had so many studios taking a crack at it after Resident Evil 1 showed there was a market for it back in 1996, that there isn't really any hard and fast defined formula. Granted, this also means that no one really knows what survival horror even is anymore, with a lot of horror games getting slapped with the label arbitrarily. However, as you iterate, you do inescapably end up emulating aspects, and sometimes this can lead to a game that feels like it's just aping what came and worked before. So, in comes Extermination, an early PS2 survival horror game from developer Deep Space, a studio that seemingly only made two games, which is probably telling a rather compelling story. Like a lot of other PS2 games, it didn't make a particularly noticeable splash and essentially died in obscurity. But as always, you have to ask, was it bad? Or did a hidden gem fall through the cracks? I am the resident gremlin, purveyor of the weird, the retro, and the forgotten, and today we're talking about 2001's Extermination. Plot starts in the typical generic way. Gruff military types in the back of a transport plane on the way to do something. The game opening cutscene itself doesn't make it clear what's actually happening other than its Operation Cold Limit. Luckily, the manual explains that Fort Stewart, a secret research base in Antarctica, sent out a distress signal 3 days ago and has been radio silent ever since. Cold Limit is the mission to find out what's happening at the base. That's all secondary to Roger here's god-awful pep talk to Dennis, who talks about his promise to protect Cindy from danger, to honour Andrew's memory. This is all covered in the game's manual. What do you mean you emulated it? And that's when one of the engines explodes and the plane goes into a crash landing, separating the team, because this is a horror game after all. As luck would have it, both Dennis and Roger landed together, right in front of an exhaust fan so they could infiltrate the base, using the time to introduce several game mechanics such as the battery and context-sensitive actions that we'll discuss when the time comes. All the facility's power is off bar the security backup, so Dennis goes to power on the main generator after having run up and down the same corridor 3 times for some bizarre reason. Game then pulls some attempted subtle shots of a weird leech thing as Dennis goes in and switches on the power, returning just in time to see his best friend and comrade be jumped by a dozen of these leeches and turning him into something straight out of John Carpenter's The Thing. Instantly. Halo's flood eats your heart out. Then Roger is gunned down almost as instantly by a mysterious woman in a hazmat suit, who tells Dennis to escape while he still can. From there, it's up to Dennis to find his team, complete his mission, find the truth about what's happening at Fort Stewart, and maybe, just maybe, live to tell the tale. Or not, because this is a classified mission. Like I said, it starts very generically, but that's not really a death knell for the story. Train squad arrives at seemingly abandoned facility, gets jumped by mystery monster, is a horror movie staple and literally the premise of Resident Evil 1. The trick is building on that and into its own thing, and Extermination does that, but arguably in the most awkward way possible. As Dennis meets up with his team and sets about destroying the base because of the aforementioned monsters, we slowly learn this is all because of a bacterial strain called HO213, which drastically mutates organic life and rapidly multiplies in water. It escaped containment, and Dr. Falcon, the obsessed head researcher that was working on it, has gone missing. The issue is that the person that tells you all about this is Cindy, the hazmat suit woman from the start of the game, and that you meet really early on, but instead of explaining anything, she just tells Dennis to rendezvous with his squad and leave, which is equally stupid because she also ends up at the rendezvous point herself and still says nothing until you start activating the bombs. And this isn't helped by how the game conveys the story either. A lot of what's happened is in text logs around the facility, similar to what Resident Evil games do, but the difference is when the cutscenes come around, Jill and Chris typically talk or act under the assumption that they know roughly what's going on for the most part, and that you, the player, have collected and read all the notes up to that point. Extermination, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. Cutscenes play out as though you've seen none of the logs strewn around Fort Stewart, so you can end up learning about HO213's reaction to water pretty early on, but Dennis will still have his gormless eureka moment about the water. It's a bizarre disconnect and genuinely hurts the story in my eyes. Another problem is that everything feels rushed. Not in the sense that it feels unfinished, but more so that it sets up so many story beats for such a short game that most of them don't ever get a chance to breathe. For example, after Dennis makes his way to the power plant to meet up with the Major, he comes across another squad mate called Feral, whose dying words that the Major shot him. You'd think this would lead to some intrigue or deeper, sinister reason for your squad to investigate this base, but within 10 to 15 minutes of gameplay, you're told by the Major that Vevel was a traitor, was the one that sabotaged the plane, and was sent by the CIA to collect a sample of HO213 and remove all witnesses. So he shot him to protect the world. And that's just where the plot point ends. No additional questions, just neat, and done. Or the journalist that somehow made his way into this top secret government facility in Antarctica. You meet him twice throughout the game. The second time, there's a note that also reveals that he's the chief engineer? But that's the last you hear about it. Or him. You're on the escape craft after blowing up the facility and you completely forgot about him. The game completely forgot about him. Then there's also the revelation that Operation Cold Limit is actually Operation Extermination, where the Marines were sent in as test subjects for the bacteria's effectiveness as a bioweapon. The Major knew, Gary seemingly knew, and none of them seemed to give much of a damn about it. Extermination is a lot more focused on the relationship between Cindy and Dennis, but in a similarly rushed manner, with Cindy being very standoffish in the first half, with her blaming Dennis for the death of her boyfriend Andrew, and then timidly wanting to talk it through and make amends in the back half. Conversely, Dennis goes from wanting to reconcile to being the tell me when I get back kind of action hero type dude. All this while, the quote-unquote villain of the game, Dr. Falcon, appears from a hatch in the floor, is on screen for maybe 3 minutes, revealing that shock horror he's behind everything, then immediately dies. Come to think of it, Cindy and Dennis are really the only characters the game seems to actually put time into. I would say developing, but that's not really it. Everyone else feels like a plot device, something to progress the story and then be unceremoniously killed off. Worse, of course, being Sonia, who gives you the key to access one of the snow trucks, then gets goo-walled in the stairwell 2 doors from the safe room. It's never explained why this happens or even how, just seemingly played up as a shock death, but we've only seen her once, so it doesn't land. And this over-focus on Cindy and Dennis's interpersonal problems is to the game's detriment, because HO213 is by far the most interesting thing the story has going for it. One look at it and it's clearly wearing its inspiration on its sleeve, however it does work towards differentiating itself. How it's a form of parasitic alien that not only spreads through water, but can also manipulate it, assimilate machinery, and create those leech things to spread the infection to additional hosts. And how they created a vaccine against it, which would have been fine if Vulcan hadn't let it out. HO213 and the systems around it are honestly so interesting, but the breakneck pace of the story, even when played casually, just doesn't leave much time to let it truly develop. And sometimes it feels like the game is actively ignoring it. There is a part about 2/3 through the game where you return to Section A again, and it's completely infested. Wall to wall, the ceiling, the floor, everything is overtaken with flesh, but there's no reaction from Dennis or the game. You get more pomp and circumstance from the various really low-res corpses than you do the mutation of one of the monsters, which gets cut off by a cutscene of a floodgate opening. I realise I'm coming across really negative here and I'm sorry, but for a horror game to forego its interesting take on alien-generated body horror, as well as any and all intrigue for what essentially boils down to a melodramatic couple refusing to communicate, it's just a massive bag fumble. Before we get into gameplay, there is an elephant in the room that we should probably talk about. Eagle-eyed viewers from North America that have played this game, or 2 of you, will have probably noticed that Dennis looks a bit off. Turns out, for some bizarre reason, the NA version of this game has a different character model for our main protagonist than the Japanese and PAL versions, replacing the form-fitting black battlesuit with some slightly more believable Arctic ensemble, which honestly looks a lot better as it breaks up his silhouette so it doesn't just look like a black blob. Ironically, even for the few outdoor sections, it makes the model look more defined. And this is the same for all the Marines, and I don't think it was a particularly difficult switch because if you notice, the head and the torso don't appear to actually be connected in any conventional way. But unlike the rest of Red Light Team, Dennis also got a completely different head model, with luscious hair, thinner eyes, and much paler complexion. I have no idea why this was done, and considering the developers have not been active in over 20 years, we probably never will. There's also some differences between the title and warning screen between each release, as well as formatting changes on Genesis' status screen. But the truly bizarre difference is that the game got localized twice. Again, for reasons beyond mortal ken, the NA and PAL releases that came out 6 weeks apart have different scripts and even voice casts, with the NA version being much more of an actual localization and the PAL version being a far more literal translations, which ended up being more accurate, but the delivery is much more stilted and clunky. Here's the closest comparison.
It's a very real threat. It could lead to the destruction of Earth as we know it. HO-213 has been on this planet for a long time. But it's been lying dormant. It's an inheritance from the distant past. This inheritance has become the biggest secret our country's ever kept.
Yeah, some secret.
But so they send in an agent to capture a disease that could mean the end of the world. Those guys are nothing but scum.
It is a serious threat. It could lead to the destruction of mankind. The HO-213 has been on Earth for a very long time, but it's been lying dormant, an inheritance from the distant past. This inheritance has become the biggest secret our country has ever kept.
Biggest secret?
They sent an agent so that our country could monopolize this micro-apocalypse that could end all life on our world.
And you'll notice that the NA version is better acted, but also that the audio quality is way better, because if you listen, voice acting for the PAL version is slowed down at times to try in vain to match the lip flap. It ends up with the characters sounding like robots, which makes them really hard to hear with some of the audio mixing. Made even worse by the fact that the PAL release does not have subtitles on cutscenes if the language is set to English. The NA version does though. Like I said, the localization of this game is honestly insane. But now onto the stuff that people are actually here for, the gameplay. All that other guff, only nerds like me care about that nonsense. This is what it's really about. And there's going to be a lot of comparison to Resident Evil because it's really obvious where a lot of their ideas came from. Let's go through things in the order the game introduces them because it's easier that way and it gives me something to jump off from. First we have the battery, the second most useful tool in your arsenal. It is used for everything from opening doors, activating machines to saving, with each use taking a specific amount of charges. You start off with 6, but eventually get upgrades that give you 18 and finally 24 from a late game optional path. It's a neat concept and has some legs, but the unfortunate fact of the matter is that most of the uses for the battery include saving only use 2 charges, with the higher costs being tied to a handful of progression blocking doors and optional content, so you don't really feel the kind of worry you do when compared to Resident Evil's ink ribbons. It feels really underutilized in general, and the game could have stood to have more interactables and more interesting ways to use the battery. Next up is the action button. Honestly doesn't sound like much, but it is a huge component of getting around the facility, because it is the context sensitive action button. This means that as well as the normal climbing ladders and opening doors, we have running jumps, climbing blocks, hanging from walls, sidling, monkey bars, ziplining, climbing through vents and crouch walking. Said like that, it sounds a bit meaningless, but what it actually means is that the game gets to play around a lot more with verticality and platforming than anything that came before and honestly after. So they could hide items and files in really out of the way places and ask you to parkour your way over to find the goodies. Hell, the entire reservoir area is just a jungle gym of all of this, and I don't care if it's nonsensical, it's fun. There's even a dodge tied to fighting enemies. It's not triggered by their attacks, I'm not entirely sure it's based on proximity, but it's there. However, there is an issue with the context-sensitive action button, and that's that it's context-sensitive. This button does something special under specific criteria. Great! What if there are multiple criteria at once? And this is something the game absolutely struggles with. There will likely be numerous instances where you'll want to do one action, but the game assumes you want to do a different one because the context was also fulfilled. Want to activate the elevator? Sorry, there's an enemy on you, so you're going to have to dodge roll. Want to use this cartoonishly large cannon to fight the boss? Sorry, you happen to be moving towards an edge, so you've jumped off to your doom instead. There's even a parkour section late in the game that requires specific jump timings to clear, but it's kind of awkward to differentiate between a full-on leap and a tiny jump. Granted, these overlaps don't happen all that often, but when they do, it just causes so much goddamn frustration. Next up, we finally get to combat proper, and for that we need to talk about the SPR-4, the only gun in the game. Technically. It's an assault rifle, but don't get too excited, it's really not that good. Being the starting weapon, it's pretty weak, taking 3 times shots to take out even a single of the basic leech creatures. But where it shines is the customization, because the game goes a little overboard with it in some regards and undercooked it in others. The SPR-4, or Special Purpose Rifle, has 5 slots for attachments, so you can sort of tailor the weapon to how you prefer to play. First off, the selector, offering you single shot, burst or full auto fire modes. The faster fire rates make fighting larger enemies of the game much less of a pain on your crippled old hands, but doesn't really help with the leeches, because their stagger animations make them immune to damage, so you kind of have to fire in a rhythm to not waste ammo. Moving anti-clockwise, we have MA, or multi-attachment parts. They are primarily scopes that use up 2 slots to make it easier to hit enemies in first-person view. That's also kind of counterintuitive. You see, the game has 2 aiming types, third and first person. Third person locks onto the closest target in front of you and follows it as best as possible. First person is for precision aiming, as most enemies in the game have big dumb glowing weak points and it's a lot easier to hit it with the first person's free aiming. The auto lock does not seem to lock onto the weak point at all and just the enemy itself, which, outside of Delta's ability to lock on and fire multiple targets, is just doing what third person already does. The slot is also used for something called the Ultimate Launcher, which we'll get to later. Next is the Upper Rus, or Recon Utility Socket, and it is only ever used for the dog tag locator, which helps you find dog tags. Said dog tags are collectibles that give you bonus starting ammunition and healing items on subsequent playthroughs, and that's it. They aren't really all that hard to find without it either, but you will have it installed the entire time after you get it because there's nothing else to go in that slot. The Lower Rus, on the other hand, is the most useful one, as it's where you equip all your secondary weapons. The shotgun, the flamethrower and the grenade launcher. They are much more powerful than the standard rifle shots and have much more limited ammo supply, and kind of make first person aiming redundant to 90% of the time, because all of them are either short range or explosive, hit the weak point anyway, or just do so much damage that aiming for the big dumb glowing weak point isn't really worth it. In almost any encounter with larger enemies outside of probably the gunner types, you will be using the shotgun or flamethrower to make short work of them. The grenade launcher is a lot more boss fight coded, but luckily if you do happen to use it by accident, the game only has you take 5 damage rather than just exploding you outright. Finally, the scopes. They're scopes. One has a zoom, the other is night vision. That's it, there's nothing exciting here. We have the gun, so let's get on with the combat. It is very reminiscent of Resident Evil to the point that it's basically 1-to-1 with more robust aiming. It's a standstill and pivot style of aiming, and on paper, that's fine. However, it feels like Deep Space copied Capcom's homework without really understanding the nuance of it. So they got the how and the what, but never really asked why. A huge part of why the Resident Evil aiming system works is because for the most part you are in narrow corridors. This means, along with the generally slower enemies the game throws your way, you are rarely in a position to be ambushed or flanked unless you rush past them or the game decides to do it in a scripted event. And this is something that they carried over through the series until Village, where it gets a bit squiffy. But even RE6, the super action oriented one, followed this design philosophy. Extermination, on the other hand, is mostly large, wide open halls where enemies can easily pile on, and you have to have your head on a swivel to avoid being jumped, made worse by the fact that there are a lot of ranged enemies in the roster, and made infuriating by the worst enemy in the game. Is it the gunners, the transformed members of the facility security team and your own men? Or maybe the dogs with their endless grab attack that will kill you if you don't mash out fast enough? Perhaps the sentient water that comes alive and wants to kill you. Yes, this game has angry water, but that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is actually the Hydra, these little leeches and the first enemy in the game. These blighters appear en masse in most rooms in the game and are really hard to hit with your gun unless you use your secondary weapons, which you really don't want to be doing. They also, somewhat contradictorily, eat up your third-person lock-on the worst possible times. And just to cap things off, they also have ranged attacks and a grab that, if not shaken off, applies the largest amount of infection in the game. Ah yes, infection, the most fleshed out mechanic in the game. As you progress through the facility, you will encounter enemies capable of implying infection. Typically only 10% of the time, but the aforementioned Hydra grabs hit you with a solid 40. After hitting 100%, you become infected, and this is where the fun begins. Firstly, Dennis gets this big glowing bulb on his back, which is a neat visual indicator for the status. Second, your max HP drops to 60 and slowly drains. If you die while infected, you get the gnarliest death animation in the entire game. This just looks horrid, not sure why it kills you specifically though. Finally, in a neat lore touch, while infected, the puddles of water around the base damage you, forcing you to be much more careful about how you progress through the facility. However, fleshed out though it may be, it is sadly just an amped up version of poison, but the main issue is how you cure it. See, in Resident Evil, in the games where poison is a thing, they always place the poison curing blue herbs in the next room over from the poison dealing monsters. In Extermination, however, the only way to cure infection is with the MTS vaccine in the medical treatment systems. The issue is that there are only 3 usable in the main game, and they are almost always miles from the current objective, meaning that when you get infected, you have to drop everything you're doing, jog your ass back to the nearest MTS, which is probably located in the save room, use it, and then jog all the way back. So rather than enhancing the experience, infection just makes you stop playing the game. But it's all good because the save rooms all have battery chargers and ammo refills for your rifle, essentially removing the threat of limited saves and ammo. Remember what I said about the game copying Capcom's homework but fundamentally not understanding it? Yeah. Beyond that, Extermination has an issue where it has a lot of cool little mechanics that it either uses once and then never again, or implements really poorly. Sometimes both. Breakable padlocks, a harness that lets you shoot while hanging that's usable twice in the entire game, a single puzzle right at the start, a torch for a pitch black hallway that's only active while aiming and not moving. And then there's the water wall that uses a mechanic that is never even remotely explained. Extermination is full of neat ideas, but none of them really mesh into a coherent whole. Survival horror bosses fall in the same vein as shooter bosses. Not super mechanical, but can be interesting and memorable if done right. And Extermination's bosses aren't? There are technically only 3 bosses in the entire game. They are all a bit naff and they're all in the back half. First off, the Executioner, a big dumb wall arm. It has 2 attacks, a massive swing and a triple slam, just in different directions. But the fight is barely won at all. All you do is dodge the attack, shoot its exposed weak point, and then repeat until dead. The real threats are external. First, the run to it, as Sector B corridor is filled with gunners, stalkers, and a crap ton of angry water, meaning you can and probably will drain a lot of resources just getting to the boss. Second, the arena has 2 spike traps on the floor that hinder your ability to dodge. However, they can be taken out before the fight even starts. Finally, and call it a quirk of the coding, the Hydra can just glitch into the fight at random and they do their annoying spit and grab nonsense to just harass you into submission. It's just not a particularly good encounter when the boss is the least of your problems. Next up is this thing, the best boss in the game. The way the arena is laid out, you'd think it was about staying on the outer ring and shooting, but that's actually a trap. While on the outside, boss fires all its guns at you and is basically impossible to avoid. Get on the platform with it, however, and it basically only uses its charge stab, which is stupidly easy to dodge. It is the coolest enemy design of the game, don't get me wrong, but it's so easy once you get up close to it, the only way to lose is to throw yourself off the edge like an idiot. Not like I'd do something like that, obviously. Finally, there's Origin, the progenitor of all this carnage and the final boss of the game. It is split into 3 different phases. Phase 1 is a big dumb whale that follows your escape craft and is only damageable with the turrets littering the deck, primarily this comically large one. The issue there is the boss fires flesh mortars at you that explode that spawn Hydra. Because of course. Luckily they can't hurt you while you're in the turret, but the boss's attacks can knock you out of it. Second phase, the boss jumps onto the deck, destroying the big dumb cannon and starts stomping around, sweeping its massive arms, firing missiles and spawning even more Hydra. Extermination really likes Hydra despite literally no one else feeling the same. Beating that, the boss transitions into its final form, Evil Dennis. Yes, it basically becomes a weird alien version of you. It keeps the mortar attacks from before, but also stands around spamming its bio rifle that can easily shred your health. And if you haven't been stockpiling resources, you will die. Again, and again, and again. It is a nasty fight in general, but the addition of even more Hydra in the smallest arena ever is a 1-2 nut punch. But there is a way to make it a single, slightly less painful nut punch. In phase 1, as the mortars are about to land, climb in and out of the turret. It gives you iframes, and while it isn't 100%, it will mitigate the worst of the damage. In phase 2, a lot of people suggest clearing the Hydra using the ultimate launcher, the weapon you've been collecting for the entire game, and the one that requires a full charge of the optional battery upgrade to get. It's awful and not worth using. The AoE is weirdly inconsistent and doesn't seem to do a lot of damage to the boss either. Instead, you just stand on this box right here. For some bizarre reason, the boss can't hit you with most of its attacks, and the Hydra just don't go after you. For the final phase, climb onto the roof next to the box and tap your way to the edge so you can position yourself just in such a way that you can hit the boss, but he can't really with his rifle attacks, and you can just unload all your ammo into him. You still have the mortars to worry about, but compared to the boss itself, the damage is negligible. But the boss seems to be designed around the idea that you've been hoarding every healing item and ammo pickup in the entire game, and plays more like a resource check than an actual test of skill, which is really not what you want from a final boss. Looking back over this, despite my negativity, I didn't really have a particularly bad experience with Extermination. Sure, it has some quirks, but as a whole package, it's mostly passable. I specifically love the monster designs and the mechanics around the water, adding its own little twist to the formula. That said, I still think it's a bad game. The plot is a non-starter that feels like it doesn't know what it's really trying to be most of the time. The gameplay is very surface level understanding of the genre that doesn't commit, instead preferring to flit from idea to idea, abandoning each one in turn. Weapon customization is a neat concept, but in practice there doesn't feel like there's any meaningful choices to be made, and the bosses are very basic at best and poorly designed amalgams at the very worst. What do you think? Did you enjoy your trip into Fort Stewart, or were you similarly frustratingly underwhelmed by everything? Leave a comment, a like, and subscribe for more. I have been the Resident Gremlin, and I'll see you next time.